the Shunyatayana of Samantabhadra, the way of voidness of the primordial ultimateness. The suchness which is written here has never really been written, nor has it ever needed to be written, spoken, known, or thought of. Suchness is more immanent than the most primordial, beyond all implications of absolute ultimate transcendence. Yet it is unexceptionally ordinary. Suchness is such that high indifference and complete absorption are equally void. Suchness is such that oneness and allness are equally void. Suchness is such that multiplicity, duality, and non-duality are equally void. Suchness is such that nothing is knowledge or ignorance, consciousness or unconsciousness. Suchness is such that there is no one to be and not be. Suchness is such that everyone and everything is now, has always been, and always will be the primordial, ultimateless void. Suchness is such that there is no one to be and not be. Suchness is such that enlightenment and darkenment, dreaming and awake, are equally void. Suchness is such that there is no teaching to teach anyone. Suchness is such that there is nothing else, nor has there been nothing else, nor will there be nothing else. Space is nothing. Time is nothing. Infinity is nothing. Eternity is nothing. Endlessness is nothing. Identity is nothing. There is no one to ask or question, nothing to ask or question about. Nothing is stated that everyone understands. Suchness is such that individuality and wholeness are equally void. Suchness is such that isness and nothingness are equally void. Suchness is such that unbroken continuity and total disruption, perfect order and utter chaos are equally void. Suchness is such that all beginnings, midpoints, and endings are equally void. Suchness is such that all potentiality, actuality, and being are equally void. Suchness is such that once and only once, absolutely unique and eternally recurring, indistinguishably homogeneous, are equally void. The absolute is nothing. The relative is nothing. Beyond is nothing. No matter how degraded or exalted, abominable or ineffable, nothing is. No matter how meaningless, nothing means everything. No matter how meaningful, everything means nothing. Suchness is such that voidness is void of voidness. Suchness is such that however or whatever it takes to make the perfection of perfectionlessness so, it is so now, as is, in everything, in everyone, in nothing, in no one, no matter what appears to be or not be. It never has been, nor will be, otherwise. Welcome to the Architects of Conscious Transformation. Last time we were visiting some of the beautiful, profoundly built and symbolically significant Mahayana Buddhist works, such as at Borobudur. Here we see Borobudur as being a mandala of the cosmos, of consciousness, of the ultimate purpose of life and existence. The building itself goes in multiple layers, about 11 of them actually, if you count all the buried stuff at the base, which is related to the lower realms, the hell realms, the realms of jealous gods, titans, the realms of the hungry ghosts, those realms that are beneath consciousness as we know it in our waking physical state. And then the first level we enter into in Borobudur is the level of human life, of existence, the struggles and toils and petty concerns and conflicts that occur there. And at Borobudur, we were given a two-mile tour around the galleries that wind upward, slowly upward, from the human realm of ordinary life to some of the stories about the early incarnation or the incarnations of the Buddha, the Jataka tales as they're called, former lives of the Buddha, and then it went on to a well-known individual known as Manahara, who was a seeker for enlightenment, and then after a while the graphic illustrations that were carved in the walls were then allowed to unfold into the story of Sadhana. Sadhana is really a seeker for the perfect wisdom, and he goes to these various levels of teaching in order to receive more and more profound instruction along the way. And as you go down from the third level galleries to the fourth level galleries, Sadhana encounters Samantabhadra, whom you just heard a reading from, the Shunyatayana of Samantabhadra. Now Samantabhadra is both bodhisattva in terms of the final bodhisattva who's going to become a Buddha in this cycle of Buddhas in this age that will enlighten the universe. But Samantabhadra also represents the primordial void itself, the ultimate reality. So Samantabhadra is both someone who incarnates and also that which is beyond all coming and going and is the aim and the goal and the beginning of all journeys in this or any other life. So we saw the beautiful carvings here, and of course this is a teacher, a divine teacher who is teaching the disciples about the journey into the ultimate wisdom, into the final wisdom. And as you saw on that previous page, this is Prajnaparamita, the mother of all Buddhas, the divine wisdom. The divine wisdom, the transcendental wisdom, which basically is the seed bed, the beginning and end of all journeys once again, synonymous also with Samantabhadra. It is the expression of this wisdom that has motivated the building of such profound monuments and architectural works as Borobudur. Here, after we have gone through the stages of learning and initiation, we arrive at the realm that is now open and free like the sky, infinite space, the open mind, the clear mind, the one that has unified the heart with itself and its actions. So the heart, body, mind, all of them, the speech, all of those are together in one unified incarnation, an incarnation of the empty relational form. It is here only for the purpose of liberating and awakening all beings, and its only function is for that to happen now, as is, for everything and everyone. It is the way of the Bodhisattvas, but it's also the way of the Buddhas, because the Buddhas are always here. They never come or go. They are immanent and transcendent and co-emergent with us, every one of us, as we are now. That's what the Shunyatayana of Samantabhadra related to, the co-emergent immanence of this transcendence, that it's right here. Not just the ground that we stand on, but the very being of being that we are. And it's the ultimate height to which we shall also be going. So, at the top of the stupa, and the central stupa is dedicated to the primordial, and the immanent Buddha. Not just the eventually to be realized, but right now, always right now. This enlightenment, this awakening to fullness, to completion is always present. And the message of this monument, as with all the other monuments that we've encountered, is to awaken us, to make that dedication in ourselves, to motivate us to realize that, okay, now it's time for me to get doing this, to be this. And on Java, there's another incredible monument. I think it's called Kandisiwu. And it's also, in terms of the hierarchical structure, the second largest Buddhist building on the island of Java, but in more disrepair than Borobudur has been, but once again, dedicated to the wisdom teachings, dedicated to the awakening of all beings everywhere. It is the way of universal service, and it's always been that way. And this is the message of these monuments. Whether it's this in the terms of the Buddhist, or this in terms of the Hindu, this is called Loro Jongrang. And it is also an incredibly beautifully built construction dedicated to the Trimurti. As you recall, the Trimurti is the Trinity of the Hindu version of reality, the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and their consorts, Lakshmi, Parvati, and Sarasvati. They are represented in this great edifice, and always it's the effort toward moksha, toward enlightenment, toward liberation, that is being addressed in all of these teaching and art and architecture spaces. There has never been any other real reason for creating these monuments, or these reminders to each and every one of us about the real purpose of our existence. And that purpose has to do with our conscious evolution, but our conscious immanent realization of the perfectionless perfection that is always here in everything, no matter what it seems like. And so these works of art they go beyond mere dogmas. The messages and the symbols can go further and further and further as we develop our own understandings, as we develop our understanding as a whole group, as we develop our understanding as a whole species, as all of life on this planet. The meaning of these works is never static. It's not just related to this is what one thing means and that's the only thing it can be. No, it itself is evolving. The meanings implanted in these works are themselves evolutionary. And so then we went from the islands of Indonesia to the mainland, and this is, of course, the incredibly beautiful and profound Angkor Wat, which is mostly dedicated to the Hindu pantheon, but at the same time it is also very much in harmony with the Buddhist which went side by side along with it. And there were different dynasties in which Hinduism was transplanting Buddhism, but the point is that the teachings of spiritual development and spiritual awakening were, regardless of which point of view they were coming from, were always communicating to human beings everywhere at that time when they were built and in the present as well, that our purpose for being is transformation of our consciousness, transformation of all our unconscious tendencies toward a conscious way of being and living that would not just benefit ourselves individually or as a small group, but the entirety of our species, the entirety of the life on this planet, and the entirety of the planetary existence of this world as well. But not just there. It doesn't stop there. This work extends out beyond our local life here, our local existence on a planet. It goes into the universe, into the greater universe at large, and this kind of evolutionary, conscious evolutionary work is for the benefit of all beings. Ones that we haven't got a clue about, ones that we don't even know exist. It's for the benefit of all beings, no matter what scale, micro or macro or in between. All of this work is dedicated for the universal awakening of all. The universe being fully awake is the intention of this work that's being pointed toward. And here we have beautiful examples of the Khmer architecture that is found at the Angkors, Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, and on the left is an apsara, a divinity, a deity, a female deity, a goddess. And in the Khmer culture, we talked about the fact that it was very sex positive, that sex was a very positive force in life and a very positive means by which one could transform consciously. And so here the goddess on the left lifts up her skirt and says that I'm open to conscious sexual work, to conscious tantric work, which means tantra is the unbroken unity of being, and that sex is a means toward accessing and integrating all that into one's own conscious being. So beautiful and yet very profoundly open and almost innocent and pure of any kind of imbalance. This is not the sex of any kind of ego imbalance. This is the sex of pure transformation. And on the right-hand side, we have what could possibly be another a female, possibly Bodhisattva or Buddha, a female Buddha, who is present with her consciousness being fully awakened. And this being, through this beautiful sculptural work, expresses this unshakable, compassionate, caring presence that is so unique to the Khmer architecture and art. So we visited these wonderful examples of conscious transformation through the Khmer. And then at Angkor Thom, of course, we encountered the omnipresent, the all-seeing form of the Bodhisattva of compassion, the Buddha emanation of pure compassion that helps liberate and awaken all beings according to their specific needs, their specific scale of being. It doesn't really matter. Lokeshvara is that principle of enlightened, compassionate, loving kindness that helps us arrive at our full realization, the full realization of all our potentials, the actualization of all our potentials. And this is us. This is what we are. We are Lokeshvara. We are emanations of that. We can be that. All we have to do is be willing for that to be so. Let it happen. Check out what happens when you do. And so this is, of course, architecturally speaking, rather awe-inspiring. Underneath the arch, we walk through Lokeshvara, who's looking in every direction and seeing, hearing, responding to the needs of all beings everywhere in the way of unconditional compassion. So we went from Lokeshvara, and now where are we going? We're going maybe back in time, because the Khmer culture was in the 800s, 800s, 900s, when those great works at Angkor were built. But in Europe and all over the world, Asia, as far as the islands of the of Ireland and England, Scotland, Britain, Scotland, all throughout the European continent, and as far east as perhaps Anatolia and Turkey, but also in the southern Mediterranean and the islands of Malta, all over this vast region, there was this phenomenon in the 5th and 6th millennium, 5,000. Or was it now? Yeah. I think it was about close to about 5,000 years ago. Or 6,000, 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, some of these. Some of these are like 3,000, 4,000 BC. These are called dolmens, and we're looking at these from Russia, in the Caucasus area, in the southeastern region of Russia, in the area, in the countries known as Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Chechnya. You may have heard of that one. But in these areas and on the other side of these mountain ranges, the Caucasus, there are at least 3,000 plus of these dolmens that have been discovered. Now these dolmens, as you can see, are made out of these huge boulders, which can be 100, could be many tons, 50 tons, 20, 30 tons. These are big rocks, and they have been worked. This one is rounded. They have been carved, and then in them has been excised, has been chiseled or drilled a hole just big enough for a human body to go through. And inside these are chambers. These are chambers of initiation, and they're all over the place. And they had a specific function at one time, a very specific function in terms of spiritual initiation. And very few people know about these dolmens. They're getting to be a little bit better. I guess there's more knowledge known about them. People are getting to know them better because of the internet and so forth. But until very recently, no one had an idea that these megalithic monuments. This is from the same time frame as the great standing stones at Stonehenge and various other places. So these are much older than the previous civilizations we've been looking at, except for the the Stone Age ones, the Paleolithic ones. But this is obviously beautifully worked. The stone itself has been dressed, if you will. It's not just a boulder. It has incising on it. It has patterning on it. And these are sometimes 5,000 or more years old. And they come in various shapes and sizes, but you can see, how much would it take to move a gigantic boulder like that on top as a roof for this chamber of initiation, which incidentally was plugged as well. We'll show one with a plug as well. And those plugs are sometimes hundreds and hundreds of pounds, like 250 pounds, just to plug that hole, just to seal the chamber, if you will. Now, these chambers of initiation were obviously meant for spiritual work. There is no other possible explanation for them. And regardless of whether modern science says anything about them. These were spiritual initiation chambers, and they were worked. As you can see, there's carving and exact fitting of these. These have been leveled out on top. Now this is 5,000 years ago that these were built. And they were also, you can see, they were cut into the specific angles, into trapezoids, not just cubes. You know, different shapes to evoke or produce certain kinds of invocations, or to facilitate certain kinds of spaces that these initiates were working with. They were working with other dimensions. There's no other explanation for these dolmens other than spiritual work, because the amount of labor required at that time for human beings to create something like this, and with such precision, and so many of them. Like I said, there's at least 3,000 or more that have been discovered just in this mountain region in the southern Caucasus, in the Caucasus area. And as you can see, there's a plug there that fits into that opening. And that opening obviously had to be sealed, and there is no question that the labors were intentional, and they were based on developing human possibilities, for developing the potentialities of our consciousness. And just the very fact that these human beings in this region went to so much effort and so many different places shows that this was it had a very great following. So this is in the Caucasus region of Russia, or on the other side of it. Now, the ones that were the most interesting and most significant were ones that were actually carved out of a single huge boulder. Now this is a boulder down there at the bottom left. That's a big huge hunk of rock, hundreds and hundreds of tons of rock. And these human beings, whoever they were, basically chiseled their way into the rock and hollowed out this chamber, usually spherical, usually rounded. And they did that work. And they felt that it was important to be grounded in the bedrock of existence. I mean, this is very significant. Stone, the mineral kingdom, is seldom understood now as being of significance to our own conscious makeup. And yet, when you look at the molecular level, everything is crystalline. And so stone itself, the minerals themselves, are crystals, and they have drilled into these crystals, created rooms that have been more or less spherical, domical in structure. Inside this thing, inside that big huge rock, there's a chamber, and inside there too, inside that kind of oddly shaped boulder, there are entrances into that. There's an entrance into that allows a human being to sit and meditate and be totally, I mean totally, grounded in something unshakable. And I think that's part of it, that they looked upon this kind of structure as being unshakably real. It's not only an actual physical thing that is heavy and hard to move, if impossible to move. It represents the principle of unshakability, of ultimate stability. And they're basically taking their spiritual initiation into the nature of that, into the nature of that in physical existence. They want to be totally grounded and unperturbed in their work with this kind of force. And the force, of course, is trying to discover what it is exactly that we are here for. What exactly is this all about? What is our real purpose here? Those dolmens have a real purpose in that sense. They created spaces for us, our species, to discover the deeper implications of our existence. And this dolmen is in Ireland. So we go from the Caucasus in Eastern Europe, on the edge of Asia and Europe, and we've gone over to Ireland now. And here, one has to wonder, how on earth did human beings lift a slab that must be 100 tons? I mean, this is a huge hunk of rock. Those are bigger than human beings. They're taller than we are. The standing sides to this. How did they do this? And it doesn't really matter. They had a real motivation for doing it. It's incredibly dangerous work to do this. And to basically level out those standing stones, those boulders, and then lay something this huge on top of them is, well, it's beyond words. Because if we tried that today, we would have great difficulty doing it manually. I would think it would be almost impossible. And yet human beings, thousands of years ago, had the motivation to do this. And this other one is this other example of another dolmen, as they're called, is in England. Yeah. And then these standing stones are in Brittany, in France. These are getting more into stone circles. And there was a very great significance in the Western European artistic and building traditions to create circular sacred spaces. Very, very obvious here. I think these are the Callanish. This is in Scotland or someplace. The standing stones, once again, it doesn't matter where they are all over the place. These are just examples of these incredibly heavy stones being lifted by human beings and put into a significant arrangement, a circle usually, and it always points toward coming into a space of sanctity, of undisturbedness, of, you might say, equanimity. A circle is equal in every direction. People don't realize that our words like equanimity, which is equal in every direction, relates to something circular. A circle is that. It creates a space of equalness, of equal-sidedness, of equal dispensation, of equal giving, equal receiving inside this. And so these circles, rather than just being curiosities and primitive attempts, were in fact very sophisticated in their understandings. We can have primitive sort of manifestations, let's say, of things, but the meaning behind them can be extremely significant and subtle. And that's another thing about art. This is an aerial view of the great megalithic site at Avebury in Wiltshire, which is right by Stonehenge, which we will see next after Avebury. But these standing stones go in a huge circle, and you can see that there's a village inside the original sacred site of Avebury. So something very significant was happening here. There's a moat around here. They claim that it was all done with baskets, that they dug out the moat with baskets and threw the dirt around. And these big, huge rocks, which are, they're big. I mean, there's people. I mean, these are 10 feet high. These are 50, 100 tons, some of them. How did human beings manage to move these and precisely place them? It's not just the how, but it's the real motivation why. And to me, it's obvious that this has to do with something more significant than mere survival. Every one of these locations suggests a higher purpose, that human beings are connecting to a cosmic movement, a cosmic injunction in all of us that we need to seek a greater understanding of what our real purpose is. It's not just that we're small in scale on the surface of a planet. It's that we are, in fact, attempting to commune with and be one with a greater cosmic purpose. And all of these sites, for example, this is an aerial view of Stonehenge, which is probably the most famous megalithic monument in the world. It's not a matter of wondering, well, how did they put, 15 or 20 foot high stones and then notch them, put little thumbs on the top of them, and then put holes in the adjoining lintels that they placed across these huge stone posts. There has been so much discussion about that. And the point is, though, and the discussion is usually, well, were supernatural means used? Were anti-scientific methods used in order to construct these? Does it really matter what anyone believes? The fact is, these exist, and whatever the sets of beliefs one holds, these stand as a reminder to us that something absolutely extraordinary was required in order to create these. 3,000 BC, 5,000 years ago or more. I mean, think about what we today could do. If you were just told, okay, let's go get this giant boulder out of the ground, and if all we had were hand tools, primitive hand tools, and then we need to dress them, straighten them out, carve them, make notches like that, and but make those little extrusions on top, and then put a notch on the other one and line it up so that it would work exactly right. When we actually were able to lift a 50-ton hunk of rock on top of it, what do you think you would be doing? What would you think of doing? We didn't have cranes. What would you do in order to put this into place like it is? It's much fallen down now. But what would you do to create something like this? Ask yourself this, because seriously, one doesn't have to have very deep understanding in order to know how extraordinarily special something like this, a place like this, would be. This would require the highest technology, the greatest efforts that a community could make, and the knowledge, whatever it was enough, more than enough, to create this. Now, of course, there's various theories. There's 60 stones on the outer and the inner circle, and then there's 19 more, I think. The numbers are significant because all of this has to do with a certain kind of numerology, and numbers were significant to those people, to the Druidic people that constructed this. And it doesn't really matter about the theories and about the modern day practices. Those are, in a sense, not the point. The point is that for each individual to recognize that we have this possibility in ourselves. Those were human beings too. We are human beings, and we as human beings can, if we really, really put our attention into it and put our hearts into something and open ourselves up to a real community effort, because this wasn't done by one person. This was done by an entire group of human beings acting as an integrated whole that allowed this to happen. And every time anything what we call great has happened, it's been when we have unified ourselves. We have all come together with a unified center of gravity focus. This required a center of gravity focus in order to be realized and in order to be maintained. All the speculation about what it was for doesn't really matter. Yes, modern science has discovered that it has an astronomical significance, but what that astronomical use was, why it was used in that way, these obviously are open to the air, to the elements. These could be sun temples in that context. The sun was considered the source of life, the source of that which brings life. So this might have been in reverence to that force of reality in human life. But it doesn't really matter. You know, here's the sun at the summer solstice going over a particular stone in alignment. And this is significant to astronomers because it has an astronomical significance. But for those who are into more than that, into religious or spiritual applications for Stonehenge, there's obviously much more to this than simply saying, okay, at this time of the year the sun does this, oh, we have to plant our crops. Or that's not it. You don't need anything like that to plant crops and to harvest them. You don't need that for subsistence. You don't need that for just surviving. This relates to an aspect of our humanity that goes beyond survival, that senses and knows that there is something beyond mere physical mortality involved with what we are as human beings. Now what that is up to each of us to discover. Each and all of us. We're not alone in this quest. Now, I think this is cerulos. This is a gold beaten kind of engraving of the Celtic god with the antlers. And there are 7 antlers on each of his, 7 antlers on each side of that rack of antlers that he's wearing. Obviously it represents something related to the stag, which may be fertility, but on his left hand, or his right hand, facing left our way, is a symbol that looks very similar to the Sumerian symbol for infinity. And in the right, or in the left hand, on his left hand, there seems to be represents change and possible growth. I mean, this can go deeply into the inner significance of many things. There's lions, there's also, or it could be a wolf, I'm not sure. Those are wolves, perhaps, and deer. So there's an active-passive element to this work of art. And the thing to remember is that none of this art is just, how can I put it, just what is superficially there. There's an implication to everything related to the sacred art, and they wouldn't make this just as a domestic ornament. This would have to be something of very, very high import, which would be placed somewhere where it would have sacred significance. And so this art, as in all the other work that we've been looking at, relates to deeper implications of the reason for our existence, the reason for all existence. And so the Celts and whoever else predated them built some amazingly impressive structures. This is Newgrange in Ireland. And this is a burial mound, but it's more than a burial mound. They did find bones and so forth in here. It is a burial mound of a large size. However, there's something more to this. You can see how big it is because look at this group of people here, so it's gigantic. But it wasn't just for burying people, it was also a place of initiation into death, into going beyond death. And it definitely had knowledge of the three forces. The three forces being a positive and a negative and a reconciling force in reality. And these are carved right on this gigantic boulder that is at the entrance to New Grange. And inside, this motif is once again present, inscribed there. And some say this is the feminine aspect. Whatever aspect, I think it's both. It's beyond masculine and feminine. It seems to me to be a balancing of force rather than male, female. I think it's got to do with that which is balanced no matter what one happens to be at that point, male, female, or otherwise. But it's relating to perfect balance. And so inside, of course, is the chamber, and the amount of labor and also the amount of effort required, not just physically, but intellectually, emotionally, and in an integrated way to build these massive structures really makes one recognize that at no time are we as human beings or as beings limited by the particular physical circumstances that we're in, because great art, great architecture, and you might say that which transcends our apparent capabilities at that point is always available. That people who were in a very so-called primitive society were able to build very sophisticated and profound works, profound even to us today. Yes, we're in the 21st century now, it seems. So it seems. But 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, human beings were creating works that still have profound significance for us, which means that it transcends our time. It transcends the space we're in, which means the kinds of artifacts we find within our space, the machines or the utensils or whatever else. This is an essential aspect to our human nature. So now we go from Ireland down to another island in Malta. And here again is another megalithic structure about 5,000 years old on the island of Malta. So this is in the Mediterranean now. And so these huge stone edifices were common throughout the world of that time, where there were human beings. They were creating these massive, here you go again, post and lintel, gigantic rocks to carry, and human beings were small then, quite short. And so you might say that the entranceways may not have been as high, but the sheer weight of these blocks and the way that they've been dressed and straightened and leveled obviously indicates an understanding that is sophisticated. And so that was Europe and the surrounding areas that we know about. And during much of the time that other parts of the world were developing what we call great civilizations, Europe in general was considered to be sort of a barbarian place with warring tribes who were very, very hard to get along with, and until the Romans basically moved their armies across all of Europe and conquered every tribe and made it into the Roman Empire, there really wasn't any of the more supposedly sophisticated type of architecture in that area. It was a huge, like the Stonehenges and that, but what brought all of this together was the Romans eventually. And at one time, of course, when the Romans were in the European Western lands, they introduced especially during the time of the Caesars, Augustus. During the time of Caesar Augustus is when everything started to really synthesize, or the in the old world supposedly went into the barbarian lands, and with it the architecture and art. And so it affected everything greatly thereafter. And so one of the outstanding figures in all of human history is an architect named Vitruvius. Now, Vitruvius was the architect of Caesar Augustus, of biblical fame, and the one that is referred to in the Christian Bible. And Vitruvius wrote a simple treatise for the emperor to get a liberal education related to what architecture and everything else related to it was. Now, architecture was in fact considered at that time, 2,000 years ago, it was considered to be the supreme achievement. To be an architect was to have mastered all the other arts, all the other sciences, and so to be an architect was kind of the integration of everything that a human being could be. So architects were very great beings, in other words. So, in relation to this, we have all seen this because it comes from one of the greatest and most brilliant geniuses of world art, Leonardo da Vinci. And this is known as the Vitruvian Man. And the reason that it's known as the Vitruvian Man is that everything here that is shown in this diagram, in this drawing by Da Vinci, relates to the symmetry that Vitruvius laid out in terms of the relationship of the human body to temple architecture. In other words, temples, those places of worship and sacred initiation and so forth, in the Roman and Greek traditions which preceded them, all had to do with what was considered the perfect symmetry of the body. That the human was in fact a measure of all things, that the human body was a measure of divinity incarnate. And so, for the human body is so designed by nature that the face, from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair, is a 10th part of the whole height. The open hand from the wrist to the tip of the middle finger is just the same. The head from the chin to the crown is an 1/8, and with the neck and shoulder from the top of the breast to the lowest roots of the hair is a 1/6. From the middle of the breast to the summit of the crown is a 1/4. If we take the height of the face itself, the distance from the bottom of the chin to the underside of the nostrils is 1/3 of it. The nose from the underside of the nostrils to a line between the eyebrows is the same. From there to the lowest roots of the hair is also a 1/3, comprising the forehead. The length of the foot is 1/6 of the height of the body, of the forearm 1/4, and the breadth of the breast is also 1/4. The other members too have their own symmetrical proportions, and it was by employing them that the famous painters and sculptors of antiquity attained to great and endless renown. So similarly, in the members of a temple there ought to be the greatest harmony in the symmetrical relations of the different parts to the general magnitude of the whole. Then again, in the human body, the central point is naturally the navel. For if a man be placed flat on his back with his hands and feet extended and a pair of compasses centered at his navel, the fingers and the toes of his 2 hands and feet will touch the circumference of a circle described therefrom. There you go. And just as a human body yields a circular outline, so too a square figure may be found from it. Yep. For if we measure the distance from the soles of the feet to the top of the head, and then apply that measure to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, as in the case of plane surfaces which are perfectly square. And this is the Vitruvian man. Yeah. And they use this type of proportion, these types of proportions, in every element of building, from the bases of pylons and pillars to how many there should be in a certain length. Of course, the golden section, the golden mean proportion phi, was continuously used because they had found that this particular ratio, was everywhere in nature to be found. And so that's why they considered it to be of divine origin, because it was so universal in its expression. Therefore, since nature has designed the human body so that its members are duly proportioned to the frame as a whole, it appears that the ancients had good reason for their rule that in perfect buildings the different members must be in exact symmetrical relations to the whole general scheme. So hence, while transmitting us the proper arrangements for buildings of all kinds, they were particularly careful to do so in the case of temples of the gods, buildings in which merits and faults usually last forever. So they were extremely conscientious and careful. And this is what the Romans brought to the European cultures. They brought this type of geometry, this type of building technique to the previous culture, or the indigenous cultures that lived there for thousands of years before Roman occupation and rule happened. But as a result, we had many innovations, and once of course the Dark Ages were over, it was discovered that during the Renaissance these proportions that Vitruvius had basically instructed other architects, which are still, there are still architects using the books of Vitruvius. And I think it's standard reading for any architect to start with Vitruvius as a primer for where architecture has come from. And the geometry and the proportion, for example, here in the great late Gothic cathedral at Milan, here is the elevation right from the foundation to the spire tip, and then the plan, the ground plan of Milan. Obviously, very human in nature, cruciform. But here's the thing. Here, exactly displayed before us, is Vitruvius's law of proportion, the laws of proportion as demonstrated by Da Vinci in the Vitruvian Man, and here the body of the cathedral, also expressed in the same proportions. And so Da Vinci was able to show through this drawing, which is probably the most famous drawing now about humanity that exists, the most famous humanist drawing that has ever existed, is from Vitruvius. It is Vitruvius's proportions of architecture, and here you can see that the cathedrals were built exactly using this method and technology. And so the Romans brought this to Britannia. Here it is. Here's a still existing Roman arch in a London street, across a London street. And the curved Roman arch was one of the profound and basic innovations that the Romans introduced into all the cultures that they occupied as the Roman Empire at that point. This is the city of Bath, with the Roman baths that are still there. Cleanliness is next to godliness. And the Romans, some of the Romans at least, recognized this not just as a physical necessity, but as a spiritual baptism. And baptism was practiced well before other religious parties decided to use them as their own. So the Romans were there, and they introduced the principles of Greek, and even before that, Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Sumerian techniques, the ratios, such as phi, the golden section, and then also the transcendental relationship, the transcendental number pi, for example, which then became part of the medieval Fibonacci series as well, in a sense, or phi. Actually, it was phi. All of these ratios and numbers elicited something else, an attempt to create more complex and yet at the same time integrated art. And so this is from some of the islands in Scotland. The one on the right is from Iona, and that is on the left is also a Celtic, ancient Celtic cross, probably from the Middle Ages. But these crosses used the indigenous Druidic Celtic kinds of symbology, the eternal knot that was present not just here, but you'd find this same kind of motif in places like Tibet and others. In ancient Sumer, they had similar designs, and it doesn't take too much of a leap to understand that. Let's say, in the times of the Sumerians, there may have been a few travelers, mystics, wanderers, artists, and they may have settled far away. They may have gone to the end of the known world, which might have been at that time the islands of Ireland, or in Great Britain, the United Kingdom as it's called now. Those individuals, and it only takes one, might have introduced motifs from those lands, and then they were just basically maybe even taken further than the originating place that they came from. It's not hard to conceive that it only takes one individual to radically change an entire culture. And so these interweaving kinds of motifs suggest a very organic, vegetation-based kind of focus for the peoples of this culture. And so this Celtic cross from the island of Iona has great significance, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, after the fall of Rome, to the invading so-called barbarians, the barbarians as they were called to the Romans, from all the other European countries, when that place fell, the indigenous people then reverted to the ancient traditions, the Druidic perhaps, and whatever other religions were practiced at the time, so-called paganism, which was related to connection to nature, connection to the sanctity of nature, which doesn't sound that pagan when you come to think about the actual integrity of all of existence. But in any case, on the island of Iona was an individual later to be called Saint Columba in the 500s, who then, with his group of disciples, started working on what would be called the Book of Kells and other beautifully illustrated manuscripts of the biblical works, and through this small group of people, these dedicated early Christians, during the Dark Ages, they were able to then go from Scotland and Ireland all the way into the Eastern European, across the Channel, east onto the mainland, into continental Europe, and they were, in fact, the initiators to reintroducing Christianity to Europe when the Dark Ages, as they're called, came about in Europe. And there was a great deal of turmoil, strife, and chaos, generally speaking. So that small group of monks from Iona reintroduced Christianity to Greater Europe. And eventually, by the turn of the millennium, by 1000 AD, as it's called here, during that epoch, during the millennium, there was a great deal of enthusiasm. There were many catastrophic, apocalyptic predictions, most of which didn't come true, in terms of the total demise of humanity and all that. However, at the time, by the thousands, there had been various rounds of architecture, and the elegant style of the Romans that you saw from the 1st century in Bath were eventually adopted in a more crude fashion by local artisans and who didn't have all the information, but they copied existing works, and so they'd build columns, but they weren't exactly symmetrical and proportional, and so they were rather crude. But by the time the year 1000 rolled around, there were very, very large structures being built in terms of churches and abbeys, and even from the, let's say, 700-800s on in Europe, there were large buildings built that were churches and monasteries. However, they were, I don't say however, they were called Romanesque. Romanesque means that they were trying to copy or emulate the previous great Roman Empire and its architects. Now here in France at Tournus, we have an example of a huge Romanesque church, abbey church, called St. Philbert. Now St. Philbert, as you can see, is classic gravity-based architecture. You can see this, like it's just solid right from top to bottom, and you've got the curved, the rounded Roman arches, of course, but it's a lot of masonry, and that's a lot of rock. That's a big pile right there, but not that much light. You know, there's windows at the top letting things in, but you can't put too many holes in this kind of architecture, because if you do, it'll weaken it, and eventually the load on top of it will come crushing down, and it'll collapse. And so these buildings, the Romanesque ones, could only go so high before just the weight of gravity and dynamic tension would collapse everything in on itself. And you can see inside, you've got the round pillars, rather, well, I wouldn't say crudely, but they're not as smooth and rough, and certainly not as beautifully done as the Greek and the classical Greek and classical Roman pillars that were being copied in these buildings. But then again, a lot of the time these were not trained architects and trained builders. These were local people building. There was somebody who knew something about it, but in terms of real architects, maybe there really weren't that many at the time leading up to this. And much of the knowledge that had been disseminated and distributed during the Roman occupations and during the Roman Empire was destroyed. As mentioned earlier, the Romans had the formula for concrete. Like those concrete sidewalks that you walk on every day, the Romans had it 2,000 years ago. During those Dark Ages, that formula was lost. They had the writings as to what the substances were used, but nobody knew what they were. They didn't know the actual formulas or the actual ingredients, the actual physical ingredients that were required to make concrete, and so they lost that for over 1,200 years, that formula. And so here we have, you might say, inspired amateurs building these buildings. And the communities took part. A lot of buildings in terms of religious buildings, especially in Europe, were a community effort. Everyone who could be involved got involved because this was for the spiritual well-being of the entire group. And so by the year 1000 or so, there was a great deal of excitement that really something significant in terms of the final return of Christ to earth and God's kingdom on earth was going to happen. So by the year 1000, there was a fever pitch of expectation and activity in terms of building sacred edifices. And so the Europeans started these, maybe with local groups, but eventually more professional builders and architects developed out of this whole atmosphere of anticipation and just an entire group's wish to realize what they considered from biblical reports to be the ultimate state of humanity, which was the realization of the New Jerusalem on earth, that God would convert earth into heaven. And so they wanted to build buildings that were, in a sense, inspired by and sufficient unto being accepted as that by God, their version of God. And so that Romanesque building that you saw, St. Philbert, was at the same time contemporaneous with, you might say, the most influential group of monks and builders at the time, and that was the Abbey at Cluny and the great Abbey Church of Cluny, which was until the 1800s the biggest church in Christendom, until it was demolished, which we'll get to at some other time. But it was a Romanesque church, so it had rounded arches. It was aspiring to go higher and to reach higher elevations, have more light inside of it. They had created the platform for what was to become known as the Great Gothic Age, the age of Gothic cathedral building. But Cluny was the predecessor and you might say the greatest influence, because monks and emissaries from Cluny went everywhere. They were the most influential order in Christendom at the time, very influential with the Pope in Rome, and everywhere they went, they spread the dogma, the teaching, the belief that through sacred architecture, through an anagogical function in the art and the architecture, one could be transported just by entering this sacred space. And so then, with Cluny, began the period of monumental church building in Europe. And from the 10s and 1100s on, Cluny became the center, you might say, of learning and of techniques that advanced the development of, you might say, Gothic Christianity, European Christianity, where architecture and art were used in the service of elevating the consciousness and of bringing human beings into this sense of connection with the majesty and the sublimity of the divine as they understood it to be. And so, yes, with Cluny, there's unfortunately a downside, because eventually the most beautiful Romanesque church in all of European culture was destroyed by the mobs of the Revolution, during the French Revolution, and they tore down everything, and except for one of the towers and the entry gates. If you look at this, you'll see those two stumps over there, those two bell towers there, and that right tower, not the central one, but the right one, are all that now remain, and there's an entire village that has grown up inside what used to be the church. So Cluny was huge, well over 600 feet or more, really big, even by today's standards, and it was beautiful. They had stained glass and everything else that accompanied it during succeeding generations and centuries. And that, but Cluny was basically the first step into what became the Gothic Revolution. And so from Cluny, we'll see that Cluny still had the round arches, but they were going for what became the Gothic or pointed arch. And the interesting thing about these arches, that's one of the things that identifies Gothic architecture from Romanesque, is that the Romanesque had the round arches, still the Roman arches, but with Gothic architecture, the architects, the builders, were seeking something more. They wanted height. They wanted to go higher and higher and higher. And yet they understood, too, that you could only do so, especially with stone materials, you could only go to a certain height before the material would become just impossible to control, and any shift in the foundation from a huge pile would just make it collapse, and it would destabilize and be a pile of rubble in no time. So they could only go a certain height. Style architecture, just gravity-based architecture. What was discovered by the Gothic architects was that at a certain point, instead of using just one circle, you could use two circles to create a pointed arch. And these two circles, in terms of force and dynamic height, could be much higher, but you'd have to use these two circles in a way that would have the force of that weight distributed differently than before. Here we have a solid wall. My body is a solid wall here, right? And so all this stuff is stacked on top of me, right? On top. And I can only get so high before, just getting so tall, I will teeter over just because how big my feet are compared to how tall my body is, right? And so it's the same with a building. You can go so high, but at a certain point, you're going to lose balance, and also because of the weight, it'll be very easy for me to fall over. So what happened here is that they were able to build something much higher with these pointed arches, but what they did was they took the force of these two circles and they put them outside of the walls of the building. And they called these buttresses and flying buttresses, which we'll get to later. But the point is that instead of just using one circle, as in Romanesque architecture, the Gothic architects used two. They used the force of two circles, much bigger than an original one like this, and they were able to get wider and higher edifices as a result. And they were able to sustain the balance. But every great idea has small beginnings. Now, we talked about Cluny, but where they actually started doing something was in a very diminutive way at this abbey church in a small town called Morienval. At Morienval, they began experimenting with this. Now, this is a little squinchy arch, but this is the beginnings of what became the pointed arch in Gothic architecture. Now this is just a teeny tiny little chapel that they did this in, but this was one of the first experiments where they started doing the two-circle crossing, a quadripartite vault as it's called, where the vault is now suspended or sustained by two diagonals instead of just one curve in the middle of it. And so you can get a wider space for that pointed arch to hold up a piece of the roof or a piece of the ceiling. Those are called the ribs, and the in-between stone is called the webbing. And so that's that small place that pointed arch started in. So there was Cluny, there was Morienval, and then there was this gigantic place called Durham in, I think it's in Yorkshire, but it's up in northern England, and it's in the Norman style. The Normans from France, the former Vikings from France, invaded England, and they built this massive church, cathedral, and it's more like a fortress too, because it's built like a fortress because they were regularly attacked by the Vikings at one time. Yeah, it was a very, very unstable time, but you can see once again that it's a rounded arch. Cluny, Durham, and of course Morienval are all transitional in the sense that they're transitioning from one form. So Durham, for example, had quadripartite vaults, but they're round. They're still round. It's still Roman in style, and yet it has the quadripartite vaults. You've got those massive pillars. You can see the rounded arches here too, of the Romanesque style, and yet they are going for that pointed arch, that attempt to rise into more elevations, into a higher elevation. And they still haven't gotten as much light. They have massive walls as well, so very little light gets into this cathedral, even though it's huge. It's quite dark. I'm going to go back, and right here also, this is the roof line at Durham. You see, there's the central nave arch, and off to the right and the left you'll see these buttresses. Now those buttresses are there. In other words, it's quite high, and it's already using buttressing, what became known as flying buttresses, but it's inside the building, interestingly enough. The roof is over top of these buttresses, but it's the beginning of what distinguishes Gothic architecture from any previous Romanesque and other forms of architecture, and that is the pointed arch, the flying buttress, and of course what's most famous about the Gothic cathedrals is the stained glass windows. And really the beginning of Gothic starts mostly in one place, at a place called Saint-Denis, which is just north of Paris. And this church, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, was at one time actually the necropolis of all the French kings. And until the Revolution, I think up to 79 monarchs, and maybe I think even their spouses, but the kings of France were all buried in this one place. So it was actually the royal necropolis of France. And during the 1100s, early 1100s, a monk, abbot, Suger, who was a student of the teachings of Saint Denis the Areopagite, the pseudo-Areopagite, came into control and power. He had great influence on the court at the time, and at the same time he had an incredible influence in terms of the church. And what Suger wanted to do, what he wished to do, was to create an architecture that would be deserving of the descent of the Holy Spirit into these edifices. He wanted to create the New Jerusalem. A lot of the architecture borrowed ideas from the Book of Revelations, at least certain parts of it. There was definitely an apocalyptic frenzy going on during that time that led to the Crusades, but as well the ideas of having jewels in the walls and infinite light shining everywhere, and everything being perfect was taken to heart, especially by Suger. And his basic credo, his motto that spread all throughout Europe, was the idea taken from Saint Denis the pseudo-Areopagite, Saint Denis the Greek. Saint Denis, by the way, the original Saint Denis was the martyred first bishop of France. And so Saint Denis the pseudo-Areopagite means that he was a follower of of that Saint Denis. Actually, a follower of the Areopagite Saint Denis, who was now the pseudo. So the third person down in that order was a Platonist, and he believed in the theology that God is light. And that was taken up wholeheartedly by everyone in all of European Christianity. God is light. God is the supernal, inexpressible light to which we are all ascending, and we wish to invite God into an edifice, a sanctuary that is befitting that God of light. And so they created an architecture that would accommodate this seed idea. This seed idea. And so, by the way, you can see here, this is the stained glass that was created from that time frame. This is actually from the west window, under the west rose, actually, of Chartres Cathedral. But when the glaziers and architects moved from Saint Denis, they went directly to Chartres, and they probably the same people who created the windows in Saint Denis created these western ones in Chartres. And so this is what resulted. Now this is a later development, and perhaps it would be a good thing to start this today. It's, like I said, the necropolis, but he was considered by that culture the father of the nation. So that's the title that was given to Suger, and it's the only time that's ever been given. So Suger was the father of the nation of France at that time. He was that important. His ideas were so powerful and so all-encompassing in the sense of the influence that they had, that he was given that title, and it spread everywhere. It took, as a nation, 1/3 of the gross national revenue to create the cathedrals and buildings that came up during this great age of cathedral building and church building. 1/3 of the gross national resources. So not only did he contribute to their inception, but he actually helped to develop the forms. And there are different developments in the Gothic. Now, Saint Denis started out as the first example of this, and really, you might say the the bottom windows you see at there, at the bottom of this left side image, those are the original stained glass windows that were built during the time that Suger was present. And actually, that's Suger in this stained glass window from, one of the windows that he was responsible for building. And then, as you can see, one can see things in photographs, but truly, what is remarkable about the light that comes through these windows, especially the ancient one, the old ones from the 1100s and 1200s, is the quality of light. It is remarkable. And the reason it's remarkable, I've been told, is that everyone contributed to the building of these edifices. Everyone, from the king down to the lowest serf and vassal, everyone contributed to the building of these structures. And it was said that ladies would throw their jewels give the jewels like rubies, sapphires, diamonds, emeralds were given to the glaziers, the makers of the glass, and they actually ground up precious stones and put them into the formulae for creating these windows. And so when you see the light through this, there's something so delicious and so penetrating about them. And you can see other kinds of stained glass since then, but none of them rivals the kind of quality and the kind of transcendence one finds of these ancient works. And it doesn't matter who looks at them, no matter what culture you're from, it has the same effect. So it has an objective effect on humans, on human consciousness. So this is one of the great conscious transformational examples that exist on the planet. The stained glass that occurred during what's called the Gothic building era. And so Saint-Denis and Suger was the motivator behind this. It was very, very resplendent to a degree that no one had ever experienced in that culture before. And so they built them high, and they built them fantastic in terms of the presentation. Now, Saint-Denis was originally a smaller abbey, and then it was rebuilt. First in the 1100s, when those beautiful initial stained glass windows were produced, and then about 80 years later, during the time styles of Gothic architecture, the first style or the first development was called the primitive. It's not primitive at all, but it's a little bit more simple, a little bit more. It's not as high. It was still going on the proportions of the Romanesque architecture, but they were starting to open up the walls and put in glass. And in order to be able to do that, they had to use buttresses. And then in Saint-Denis, about 80 years after the initial introduction of Gothic architecture and glass, there was the rayonnant, the rayonnant was the high, the reaching up into, stretching up into higher vaulted ceilings. And so they changed Saint-Denis from a primitive style basilica into a rayonnant one, which had very high vaults in it. And with that stretching and with the introduction of the flying buttresses, it was possible to make a tracery of support that was basically, well, actually not the tracery of support, it was just like a bird cage of stone that was there to support the stained glass, the light. The God is light theme was all important in these buildings, and it was the modus operandi for everything that was done in this time of building. And so this is what became of it. And so then they did tall windows, filled with glass, and then they did these huge wheels, these huge mandalas of colored glass, known as rose windows. And when they did that, they had created one of the most significant and most powerful statements of transcendence that humanity has ever created. They took the linearity and they took the circularity and they integrated it into the Gothic cathedral. And the Gothic cathedral became the place where all learning, all ideas of transformation spiritually took root. The cathedrals had schools connected to them, and of course there were professional groups of companions and builders who traveled all over Europe, building in sections and layers, one cathedral after another cathedral after another cathedral, until they, in the span of 100 years, they had used more rock and materials than all the pyramids of Egypt during their 3,000 years. So this was an incredibly energetic and intense time of conscious transformational art and architecture. Now, the thing about that time was that the architect, the builder, was an incredibly important personage. To be a master builder meant that one had the audience of kings and the highest nobility, no matter where they went. The greatest masters were always on call, everywhere they went. They were, in effect, they were princes, they were royalty themselves, because every king and every noble who wanted to have a chapel or a church or a great cathedral built had to confer with the master builder, and the master builder was the one who knew how to make the idea into a reality. And so the architect from the time of Vitruvius, and they did apply the same principles that Vitruvius had taught all of them. But the point being that with an architect, a great builder of the cathedrals, there was an embodiment of everything that was known in terms of knowledge. It was the cultivation of a spiritually focused human being that made it possible to become a master builder. That was the thinking. Because to become a master builder, one had to know everything about everything. One had to know everything about the liberal arts. The liberal arts were originally what was taught at the Academy of Plato in classical Greek times, and went on into, I think, the 400s AD, actually. But the idea of the architect as being the final realized embodiment of all the other arts was a fact in those days. During the Middle Ages, architects were princes of philosophy. They were princes of all the other arts. They had that integration of discipline in themselves, and through their inner discipline, they were able to create those masterpieces that still are recognized as such to this day. And they will be, as long as there are human beings, because there is an understanding that it doesn't really matter what time frame or space a masterpiece is created in, whether it was done 20,000 years ago, or 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, or today. There is this sense of eternal continuity in the work, in the way that it's present. And so the architect had to embody this presence. And so the 9 arts were the embodiment of what an architect is. So here we have the great north rose window at Laon in France. And at the center of this rose window is the key to everything else that relates to the Gothic age of cathedral building, because it tells us about what an architect, a builder, was really embodying. At the center is philosophy. Philosophy is, taken in the deepest sense, the fusion of love and wisdom. It is divine wisdom. And philosophy is at the root of becoming a master builder. And it's the prime mover. That's what moves everything. Philosophy, she is capital S, capital H-E. She, unified male, female, unified complementary energies, is portrayed holding a ladder of 9 rungs, the 9 arts, the 9 elements of conscious order. Whether the imagery is Greek or Christian, this space is the sphere of the prime mover. This is the sourceless initiation. This is where it starts from. The images, the ideas in the 2 spheres of the east and west roses in Laon, which we may see a bit later, when superimposed, produce the central medallion of the north rose. This is the superimposition of the self-creative act of being both one of the rungs on the ladder and yet its supporter. So the central idea has 8 spheres arranged around it, the other arts, the other liberal arts that make the 9 arts what they are, the 9 arts being the ground for an architect, a master builder. So the other 8 spheres represent geometry. Geometry is represented in one of these spheres. It's the dodecahedron represented that for some, and some of these windows were 12-sided, and they had the shape of a dodecahedron, which in the Platonic universe, in the Platonic teachings, represented the universe, the realization of the universe through steps, through conscious evolution. And so geometry is at the heart of one of these spheres that is part of the 9 arts. And then after geometry, there's arithmetic, the numbers. You know, the sphere of arithmetic, the function of order and number. The builder has to know this. So there's 3 of these now: philosophy, geometry, and arithmetic. And then one moves further into the sphere of music. This is a clue to the power of sound as music and its importance in the church and the liturgy. Now we can see that, you know, in this stained glass window, of course, you see philosophy in the center. And here again, in the carving of the stone, you can see that there's the 9 rungs. There is the hidden and revealed wisdom that is the basis for what the essence of the master builder is. The fusion of love and wisdom and being able to manifest that. And so here we have geometry, and then later we'll have, these aren't exactly in order. We have geometry, we have dialectic, and then we have medicine here. One example. And then we have astronomy, grammar, and music. But music was one had to know the theory and the active principles about how vibration worked. The law of vibration had to be understood. the interaction of vibrations, audible or otherwise, had to be understood by the master builder. And it unfolds knowledge that, once again, as stated, was then put into grammar. One was able to communicate. One was able to express the inner essential qualities of the inner laws. One was able to express what was inside, unfold the implicate nature of things. And this had to do not just with external objects, one had to do this within oneself. So communication, real communication, was a necessary component of it. Also, astronomy, knowing the nature of the macro and microcosms, knowing everything related to the order of the heavens and the earth. One had to be knowledgeable, completely knowledgeable in terms of that kind of knowledge. But that knowledge had to be integrated into oneself. One had to know one's inner cosmos, how one fit into the universe, how one could work the most conscientiously and the most harmonically perfectly with everything in nature. So one had to understand that astronomy was not just an outer science, it was an inner discipline as well, which was later called alchemy. But one had to be an alchemist as well as an astronomer to incorporate what one knew from the stars, from the earth, from nature, into oneself. Dialectic. It's in the central sphere there. Now, that circle there. And dialectic wasn't argumentation. It wasn't trying to put someone else down or to see if one could defeat someone through mental gymnastics. No, dialectic was to be able to develop the flexibility of mind that would allow one to take opposing, or you might say polarized ideas and take their parts equally well and then find a reconciliation to them. One had to basically take contradictory ideas and reconcile them within oneself. That was a true function of dialectic. It wasn't to become the boss of someone else through beating them down with one's superior intellect. Dialectic had to do with the ability of always being able to take anyone's part, no matter what it might be, and have oneself still remain in balance. Very, very difficult mind training if it's done properly. The only ones that really do this anymore, to any extent, in monasteries are the Tibetans. They have dialectic exercises constantly. They call them debates, but they're not really debates. One is trying to take the point of view of anyone at any time and not be thrown off by one's personal subjectivity. It's to create an objectively impartial attitude toward all ideas. Dialectic. So, medicine. Here we have medicine. And of course, it relates to knowing about herbs, to knowing about all sorts of potions, healing. And so the master builder had to be a healer as well. He had to know, he or she had to know, mostly it was he though, in those days, in this culture. But by the way, all of these are women. These arts are women. These are all feminine in nature. Geometry is feminine. Dialectic is feminine. Medicine is feminine. The 9 arts are emanations of the divine feminine. Wow. And the architect had to be able to embody each of these equally integratedly. So one had to know about the physical body, about one's body and how to keep it in balance, and what it took when it went, and what it would take to put it back into balance if it went out of balance. So this is an order of human being that is really at the top of top of everything. I mean, this is a human being who has gone through everything in order to arrive at what they truly are. And the medicine, of course, would go into possibly, I think there were other variations on it, although I seem to have lost my notes. Now, which one is the last one? And the last one, of course, would be architecture. Sometimes it was grammar that was used, but there was also rhetoric, I think, was also part of that arts, depending on which school you went to. The point is that ultimately, architecture, the building, was the final discipline, the final realization that was needed by the architect. When the architect could embody all of those things, all those arts, and successfully integrated them, then they could become a builder who was qualified to build the most sacred spaces. And so the master builder was an embodiment, you might say, of divine knowledge, of philosophy itself, of the transcendent wisdom. And this was at the root. And this is why master builders, as I said, not only associated with the people who were at the lowest levels of the social structure, they also were sought out all the time by the highest members of the culture as well. Kings, nobles, popes, you name it. The master builder had the audience of every one of those. So these were very, very special human beings, and they were accorded that kind of honor in the culture. So, this is from a crypt. This is in the crypt of Chartres Cathedral. And it was discovered under some plaster. They removed the plaster. And this is an original painting. And this painting relates to the blessing of the divine blessing on the works of the architect. So, in this portrayal, the cosmic Christ, God, is giving the architect blessings to create the perfect edifice for the cosmic wisdom, for the transcendent wisdom, of which the cathedrals and these great abbey churches and so forth were manifestations. So, there we have an example of what began Gothic architecture and art and what it turned into. And so here now is an example of what it became. You can see the difference. You can feel the difference from, let's go back a little bit. Let's just go back to, okay, here's Durham. And I can tell right away, this looks brighter, but it's actually because they did a long time exposure on this place. It's quite dark in here. I've been here, and it is really dark. It's a big cathedral, but there just isn't that lightness of architecture. There isn't that lightness of space as in the future Gothic ones. So when we speak about